Snow whispered against the window pane as the last ember in the fireplace dimmed to a tired glow. In the quiet cabin, lit only by a flickering oil lamp, Margaret Hale, 57 years old and wrapped in her wool shawl, sat alone beside the wooden table where her husband once read his Bible each night. 3 days had passed since he died. 3 days of visitors, casseroles, condolences, and a silence that hurt more than any storm outside. He had died suddenly, without a final word, without a farewell, without the chance for her to hold his hand and tell him she forgave him for every hard year they had lived. She thought the worst pain was over until she found the diary. It was hidden beneath the floorboard under his side of the bed, an old leather journal with her husband's handwriting carved deep into the cover. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted it, feeling the weight of years inside. The first page was dated the week before he died, and the first line read, "If Margaret ever finds this, then I have failed her twice." Her breath caught, her lantern flickered, and in that moment, she understood. Her husband died with a secret she was never meant to know. The winter of 1883 settled heavily over Willow Creek, a quiet frontier settlement where snow often lay untouched for days, and even the wind moved gently, as though careful not to disturb the grief of its townsfolk. On the far edge of the settlement, where the fields met the woods, stood a modest cabin of dark pine logs and a roof sagging under years of storms. Inside that cabin sat Margaret Hale, a woman of 57 with soft gray hair pulled beneath a woolen shawl and a face lined not only by age, but by years of quiet endurance. The fire burned low, red, weary, whispering. The kettle steamed faintly, and Margaret sat at the small table, hands folded, staring at the empty chair across from her. Her husband, Edward Hale, had sat in that very chair every night for 30 years, reading his Bible, mending tools, or humming broken fragments of hymns he barely remembered. Now the chair stayed empty. Edward had died suddenly 3 days earlier. No warning, no final words, no goodbye. Margaret pressed her hands together tightly on the table. Everyone in town had tried to offer comfort. Martha Briggs from the general store, young Reverend Thompson, even Sheriff Amos Boone. They had brought soup, loaves of warm bread, quilts, a jar of honey, and prayers. Prayers had filled her cabin like smoke. But the prayers could not fill the silence he left behind. Margaret leaned back in her chair, staring at the hearth. "I thought I'd be angry," she whispered into the quiet. "But I'm only tired." Her voice trembled on the last word. Outside, wind brushed against the cabin walls, carrying with it the faintest distant sound of horse bells from a wagon passing on the old West Road. She listened to the crunch of its wheels in the snow until the sound faded into nothing. With a soft sigh, she pushed herself to her feet. The room swayed slightly, not from sickness, but from the weight of her grief. The wooden floor creaked beneath her boots as she crossed the room. Just days earlier, Edward had walked across the same boards, humming softly while polishing his boots. He had worn his wool coat and mittens, preparing to cut firewood. He had turned as he reached the door, smiling faintly. Back before supper, he had said, and he never returned. A stranger from upriver found him lying still near the old elm grove, a stack of chopped firewood beside him, his axe stuck in the frozen ground. The doctor called it the heart. "It happens quick," he'd said gently, like falling asleep. Margaret had nodded numbly. She didn't know if she believed him. She didn't know much of anything anymore. Margaret fetched a small oil lamp from the cupboard and lit it, the flame flickering up with a gentle glow. She placed the lamp on the bedside table and sank onto her husband's side of the bed. His pillow still held the faintest smell of cedar and smoke. She traced the edge of the blanket. How strange it felt to cry for a man she had loved and resented in equal measure. Their life had not been perfect, not even close. Edward was a good man, but a distant one. A man who worked hard, spoke little, and carried burdens he never shared. A man who kept secrets. The last thought pricked her heart, as sharp as a thorn. Margaret shook her head. She didn't want to think of secrets tonight. She wanted to rest. But when she shifted slightly on the mattress, her heel pressed into the floorboard beneath the bed, and the wood gave a soft, hollow sound. Margaret frowned. She tapped it again with her heel. Hollow. She set the lamp on the floor and knelt beside it. Her fingers brushed the seams between the boards. One plank was slightly raised, just slightly, but enough for keen eyes to notice. Edward, she whispered. What did you hide? She fetched the small iron nail, file she kept in her apron pocket, and slid it under the plank, lifting carefully. The board shifted, groaned, and lifted. Margaret reached inside, expecting nothing more than an old tool or a bundle of letters. Instead, her fingers touched leather. She swallowed hard and lifted it out. A diary, bound in faded brown leather. Edges worn, pages yellowed with age. Edward's handwriting carved deeply on the cover. E. Hale. Private. Margaret sat back on her heels. A chill passed through her. Edward had kept many things, his tools, his habits, his quiet pride, but never once had he mentioned a diary. Her hands trembled as she opened the first page. Edward's handwriting, strong, steady, unmistakable, filled the top lines. If Margaret ever finds this, then I have failed her twice. Margaret's breath caught. Failed her twice? She turned the page slowly. The entry was dated just 6 days before his death. Her heart pounded painfully. Edward's writing continued. I have carried a secret for 30 years, and the burden has grown too heavy. By the time she reads this, if she ever does, it will be too late to tell her myself. Margaret pressed a hand against her chest. Edward, what secret? Her fingers traced the words as if touching them would give them voice. She read further. The truth begins in the winter of 1853. Not the winter she remembers, but the one I never spoke of. Margaret felt the room tilt. 1853, the year before they married. The year Edward disappeared for almost 3 months and never explained why. Margaret clutched the diary. Lord, what did you do that winter? The wind outside howled suddenly, smacking the shutters hard. The oil lamp flickered. Snow pressed against the window in thick, swirling sheets. Margaret took a shaky breath and turned another page. But before she could read further, a loud knock shook the front door. Margaret jerked upright. At this hour? In this storm? Ash. This is different story, not dog. Erase. She set the diary down and grabbed a lantern, her heart racing. The knocking came again. Heavy. Intentional. Urgent. Margaret hurried through the cabin, lantern trembling in her hand. She stopped at the door, breath held, fingers hovering above the latch. Who's there? She called softly. A voice answered, low, rough, unfamiliar. Ma'am, I'm looking for Edward Hale. Margaret's blood turned cold. My husband is dead, she whispered. Silence. Then, no, ma'am. I reckon he ain't. Margaret's breath vanished. She fumbled with the lantern, nearly dropping it. What did you say? The voice leaned closer to the door. Snow hissed against the wood. Ma'am, Edward Hale ain't dead. Not to me. Not to the men who sent me. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Inside her room, Edward's diary lay open on the bed. The ink still fresh. The secrets waiting. Her hand reached for the latch, hesitating, heart trembling. The man outside knocked again. Ma'am, open the door. I come a long way, and I bring news about the winter of 1853. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. 1853, the year Edward warned her about. The year he vowed to hide forever. Slowly, with shaking fingers, Margaret lifted the latch. She opened the door. Snow burst inside, and standing there, coat soaked, eyes haunted, was a stranger holding something in his gloved hand. Something Margaret recognized instantly. Edward's wedding ring. Her breath collapsed. The stranger whispered, Your husband didn't die the way you think. Margaret stumbled back, lantern trembling in her grasp. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the diary waited. And Margaret understood one thing. Her life of 30 years had been built on a lie. The wind rushed into the cabin the moment Margaret opened the door, carrying with it a scatter of snow that hissed across the wooden floor. Her lantern flickered violently, the flames swaying as though unsure whether it should survive the night. The stranger stepped just into the threshold, not fully inside, not fully outside. A man neither welcome nor unwelcome, suspended between worlds like the truth he carried. He removed his hat with a trembling hand. Snow fell from the brim, his breath rising like smoke in the frigid air. Margaret couldn't speak. Her eyes were locked on what he held, Edward's wedding ring. She knew every groove, every weathered scratch on it. She had watched Edward twist that ring around his finger whenever he was nervous, whenever he thought she wasn't watching. And now a stranger held it. Her voice broke as she whispered, Where did you get that?" The man's expression softened with something like pity. "Ma'am, may I come inside? The storm's tearing at my bones." Margaret hesitated, not out of rudeness, but out of fear. Fear of what he would say once her door was shut. Still, she stepped aside. The man entered with slow, cautious steps, wiping snow from his coat. He was in his late 50s, hair graying beneath the hat, eyes tired and touched by sorrow. His boots left wet prints along the floorboards. Margaret closed the door behind him. The cabin felt smaller, warmer, but no safer. She stood near the hearth, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. "Tell me your name," she said quietly. He lowered his head respectfully. "My name's Jonah Price, ma'am." Jonah, a name that seemed made for wandering. He extended the hand, holding the ring. Margaret took it with shaking fingers, as though afraid it would vanish if she moved too quickly. It was Edward's ring. Without question, she whispered, this was on his hand when he died. Jonah shifted uneasily. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "It wasn't." Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her boots. Her throat tightened. The lamp flickered. The fire spat. She closed her eyes for one breath, one long, trembling breath, then opened them again. "Sit," she said, nodding to the chair by the table. Jonah obeyed, lowering himself with a weary groan, as though his journey had taken years rather than weeks. Margaret stood across from him, the ring gripped tight in her hand. "Tell me exactly how you came upon this. Every word truthfully, or I swear I'll fetch Sheriff Boone this instant." Jonah looked up at her with sorrowful eyes. "I am to tell you nothing but the truth, ma'am. Only thing I got left worth off-errand." Margaret's heart clenched. "Then speak." He nodded, taking a slow breath. "I knew your husband," Jonah began. "Knew him 29 years back. Long before 83. Long before last week. Long before he ever planted his fields here." Margaret's fingers tightened around the ring. "You knew him in 1853, she said softly. Jonah looked startled. "You know about that winter?" Margaret nodded once. "I found his diary." Jonah's shoulders sagged. "Then you know he changed that winter. Came back different." Margaret swallowed, glancing toward the bedroom where the diary lay open. "No," she whispered. "I have not read the whole of it yet. Just the beginning." Jonah ran a hand over his face. "That winter, he and I were part of the same crew." Margaret blinked. "Crew?" Jonah nodded. "We were hired to help the railroad company clear land north of the river. Hard work, cold work, and dangerous in ways folks don't speak aloud." Margaret stepped closer. "Go on." Jonah's jaw tightened. "We were promised good pay, better than farm labor, better than anything a man like us could hope for." Margaret could almost hear Edward's voice in her memory. "Just a little more work, Maggie. One season of good pay, and we'll start our life proper." Jonah stared into the fire, as though watching ghosts dance in the flames. "But that winter wasn't what we were told. The company had enemies. Men who didn't want the land changed. Men who'd kill to stop it." Margaret's pulse quickened. Jonah continued, voice low. "And your husband, he got caught in the middle." Margaret whispered, "What happened to him?" Jonah hesitated. Then he looked up, eyes filled with his sorrow, so deep Margaret felt her breath catch. "Your husband didn't die last week, Mrs. Hale. He almost died 30 years ago, and he never healed." Faintly in the lamplight, her fingers shook as she turned the page. It began with, "The man who changed my life forever is named," she inhaled. She read the next line, and the name written there sent a cold shiver down her spine. Jonah Price. Margaret's lantern slipped from her grasp and shattered. The lantern hit the floorboards with a sharp crack, the glass splintering into tiny stars that scattered across the wood. The flames sputtered out, leaving the room dim, lit only by the faint glow from the dying fire and the moonlight pressing through the frost-lined window. Margaret staggered back from the diary, one hand pressed to her chest. Her voice trembled. Jonah Price. Behind her, Jonah stood frozen in the doorway. His face went pale, paler than the snow outside. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I can explain." Margaret lifted the diary with shaking fingers, raising it like a shield. "You? Edward wrote your name." "Your name?" Her voice cracked. Jonah stepped forward, but Margaret thrust the diary toward him as though it could stop him like a weapon. "Stay back," she warned. Jonah swallowed, hands open in surrender. "Mrs. Hale, I swear on God's book, I never meant you harm. I didn't even know he wrote my name." Margaret's chest rose and fell with sharp, painful breaths. Her eyes never left him. "Then why would he write that you were the man who changed his life forever?" Jonah hesitated. Not long, but long enough. Margaret's heart hammered. Outside, wind clawed at the shutters. The snowstorm howled as though nature itself wanted to silence the truth. Jonah lowered his head. "Because I was there, ma'am," he said quietly. "I was there when it all began." Margaret's voice trembled. "In 1853, Jonah nodded slowly. "Yes." He stepped over the broken lantern pieces with careful, respectful steps. "I won't lie to you," he said softly. "I ain't proud of the man I was back then." Margaret tightened her shawl around herself. "Sit and speak plainly. No riddles. No half-truths." Jonah lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, the old wood groaning beneath his weight. Margaret sat across from him, the diary in her lap. Her fingers traced the ink-stained edges as if they held the fragile truth of her entire marriage. She whispered, "Tell me what my husband never dared." Jonah nodded, eyes haunted. "It was winter of 53, he began. Cold enough to freeze breath in the air. Edward and I were part of a crew clearing land for the railway company. The pay was good, but the company had enemies. Powerful ones." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Edward mentioned enemies in his diary," Jonah nodded. "The kind who don't show their faces. Men who hired others to do their dirty work. Men who didn't want new tracks laid across their land." Margaret leaned forward. "But what does this have to do with you?" Jonah inhaled slowly, as though gathering courage from the warm breath of the fire. "I was hired too," he whispered, "but not by the railway." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" "I was one of the men sent to scare off the crew," Jonas said, shame heavy in his voice. "Paid to sabotage equipment, spread fear, push workers off the job." Margaret stiffened. You were there to frighten Edward?" Jonah shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am. Scare folks, yes. Hurt him? No, that wasn't part of the deal." He clenched his fists. "But one night, everything changed." Margaret's voice softened, almost in disbelief. "What happened?" Jonah's eyes met hers. "Edward found me," he said. "Found me hiding behind the supply shed with a bottle of kerosene. He thought I was just a drunk, but I wasn't." Margaret listened, breath trembling. "He grabbed me," Jonah continued, "asked what I was doing, and for the first time in my life, I felt shame, because I had no answer worth speaking. He swallowed hard. I dropped the bottle, told him everything, that I was hired, that he and the others were in danger, that worse men were coming." Margaret blinked. "Worse?" Jonah nodded. "The men after Edward weren't like me. They aimed to kill." The fire crackled as though shivering at the memory. "That night," Jonas said, "Edward could have turned me in, could have called me traitor, could have beaten me like the others wanted." He shook his head slowly. "But he didn't." Margaret felt tears rise to her eyes. "He dragged me into his cabin," Jonas said, "fed me, warmed me, talked to me like I was worth savon. He looked at me, looked right at me, and said, 'You don't have to be the man they hired.'" Margaret covered her mouth, tears falling freely. "Edward," she whispered. Jonah's voice thickened. "He saved me, Mrs. Hale, when no one else thought I was worth a prayer." Margaret closed her eyes, steadying her breath. "But if he saved you," she whispered, "then why did he write that you changed his life forever?" Jonah shook his head gently. "Because I failed him." Margaret's heart clenched. Jonah's hands trembled slightly. A week after that, the Rayall killers came. Margaret felt her stomach twist. We were working in the woods when they arrived, Jonas said. 5 of them. Heavy coats. Masks. Guns. He swallowed hard. I tried to warn Edward. I swear I did. But they were faster. Margaret gripped the diary tight. They beat him, she asked, voice barely audible. Jonah nodded. They broke him nearly to death. I fought back. I tried, but they knocked me out cold. Margaret stared at him in shock. When I came to, Jonah continued, I dragged him to safety, hid him under a fallen wagon, kept him alive till the doctor came. He lowered his eyes. I couldn't stop them. I couldn't save him fully. That's how I failed him. Margaret's voice cracked. But Edward survived, Jonah nodded. He did, but he never healed. Not in his body, not in his mind. He carried fear home with him like a shadow. A fear he tried to bury so deep he hoped you'd never see it. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her lips. And those men paid to kill him, she whispered. Had they found him again after 30 years? Yes, Jonas said softly. They don't forget debts, ma'am. And Edward owed them a life. Margaret trembled violently. But why come now? She whispered. After all this time? Jonah hesitated. Then, because he told me to bring you a warning. And this ring. Margaret stared down at the ring in her palm. A trembling breath escaped her. What warning? She whispered. Jonah lowered his voice. That his death wasn't the last part of the plan. The men who killed him ain't done. Margaret felt ice run through her veins. What do you mean? Jonah's eyes lifted slowly. Mrs. Hale, the man who ordered Edward's death. He knows about the diary. Margaret's eyes widened in terror. He knows you have it. Margaret gasped. Her hands flew to cover the diary instinctively, as though someone were reaching through the walls to snatch it away. Jonah stood quickly. We must leave tonight, he whispered urgently. If they find you with that diary. A thunderous pound rattled the front door. Margaret screamed. Jonah spun toward the sound. Another heavy strike. The wood cracked. Snow blew through the gaps, spiraling into the room. Jonah grabbed Margaret by the shoulders. Get the diary. Now. Margaret clutched it tightly. The door exploded inward. Wind howled. Snow blasted across the floor. And standing in the doorway, tall broadcoat dripping with ice hat pulled low, was a man Margaret had never seen before. But Jonah's face turned ashen. He whispered one word. Calder. Margaret's breath froze. Calder stepped inside, brushing snow from his gloves. His voice was low, cold, unbearably calm. Evening, Mrs. Hale. I believe you're holding something that belongs to me. Margaret clutched the diary to her chest. Calder's eyes hardened. I'll ask only once. Margaret backed away, as Calder reached inside his coat and drew out a long, gleaming 19th century revolver. The revolver gleamed beneath the trembling lamplight. Cold metal, cold eyes, cold night. Margaret's breath vanished in her throat as Calder stepped fully into the cabin, shutting the broken door behind him with the slow, heavy finality of a coffin lid. Snow fell from his coat in quiet clumps. His boots thudded against the floorboards. His gloved hand tightened around the gun. Jonah stepped protectively in front of Margaret. Calder, he said, voice low with fear and anger. Don't do this. Calder's gaze slid toward him. Jonah Price, he said with a thin smile. I wonder how long it would take for you to crawl back into this mess. Jonah didn't move, didn't blink. I ain't crawling anywhere. I'm standing right here, between you and her. Calder tilted his head. A noble turn for a man once paid to do my dirty work. Jonah flinched just slightly. Margaret looked between them, her heart hammering. You two, you know each other. Jonah's jaw tightened. We were part of the same world once, he said bitterly. A world your husband saved me from. Calder chuckled. Is that the story he told you? That he saved you? His eyes gleamed. I recall it differently. Margaret clutched the diary tighter. Calder stepped closer, boots leaving wet marks on the floor. Mrs. Hale, he said softly, I came for one thing. That book. The one your husband should have burned 30 years ago. Margaret backed away, the diary pressed to her chest as if it were a newborn child. No, she whispered. Calder's eyes narrowed. No. Her voice steadied just barely. This is my husband's truth. His words. His burden. You have no right. Calder raised the gun. I have every right, he said coldly. Your husband wrote about me. That was his mistake. Margaret's voice broke. He wrote about your crimes? Calder smirked. Ma'am, men like me don't commit crimes. We commit necessities. Jonah lunged forward. You killed him. Calder shrugged. Eventually, a debt is a debt. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Jonah stepped closer to Calder, fists trembling. You ruined his life. 30 years he lived in fear. Calder turned slowly toward him, and he should have kept fearing, because fear kept him quiet. His conscience, however, he clicked back the hammer of the revolver. Did not. Margaret shoved the diary behind her shawl, stepping back toward the bedroom. Calder noticed. His voice hardened. Don't make this difficult, Mrs. Hale. Hand it over. Jonah moved swiftly, placing himself directly in front of her. You're not touching her. Calder pointed the gun at Jonah's chest. Move. Jonah held his ground. No, Margaret grabbed Jonah's sleeve. Don't, please, but he didn't budge. We got nothing worth dying for, Jonah, Calder said quietly. Jonah shook his head. You're wrong. I owe Edward my life, and I ain't letting you hurt his wife. Calder's jaw twitched. Then this is how it ends. You pulled the trigger. Margaret screamed, but the shot didn't hit Jonah. Jonah had thrown his shoulder into Calder at the last instant, knocking his arm sideways. The bullet ripped into the wooden wall, splitting it with a violent crack. The room erupted into chaos. Jonah and Calder struggled, boots scraping, fists colliding. The gun slid across the floor, spinning beneath the table. Margaret! Jonah shouted. Go! But she didn't go. She couldn't. Not while Jonah fought alone. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth and swung it wildly. Calder ducked, the poker missing by inches. It clanged against the wall, sending sparks from the fire scattering across the floor. Calder slammed Jonah against the table. Wood cracked. Lantern light shook. Jonah groaned in pain. Margaret swung again, this time catching Calder's shoulder. He grunted, staggering. Jonah used the moment to shove Calder hard, sending him crashing into the pantry shelf. Glass jars shattered. Dried herbs spilled onto the ground. Flour dust rose like smoke. But Calder recovered quickly. With a snarl, he grabbed Jonah by the coat and threw him across the room. Jonah collapsed near the hearth, coughing from the impact. Margaret's heart hammered as Calder turned toward her. Enough of this, he hissed. She backed into the bedroom doorway, clutching the diary so tightly her knuckles turned white. Calder walked toward her slowly, breathing hard. You can't run, Mrs. Hale. Not in this storm. Not at your age. Margaret lifted the poker again. You will not take this diary, she whispered, voice shaking but fierce. Calder laughed softly. You think Edward kept it to save you? You think his words were meant for you to read? Margaret's chin quivered. Yes. Calder stepped closer. No, he wrote it to save his own soul. He never meant for you to suffer his sins. Margaret's voice rose. Sins you forced him into. Calder stopped, just a few feet away. Mrs. Hale, hand it over, or I'll take it the hard way. He reached for her. Jonah roared behind him. Leave her be. He tackled Calder from behind, and both men crashed into the wooden table. It broke under their combined weight, collapsing into splinters. Calder punched Jonah hard. Jonah groaned, blood spilling from his lip. Margaret stepped forward, but Calder grabbed a shard of broken wood and pressed it to Jonah's throat. Enough, he barked. Margaret froze. Calder panted, the shard trembling at Jonah's neck. One more move, and I slit him open. Jonah struggled weakly. Margaret, don't. Calder pressed harder. A thin line of blood formed. Give me the diary. Margaret's tears spilled silently. She looked at Jonah, his face pale, breath, shaking eyes, pleading that she not give in. Then she looked at the diary. Edward's diary, her husband's voice, his secrets, his final truth. Her heart shattered like thin ice. She stepped forward slowly. Calder's eyes gleamed greedily. That's right, he said softly. Hand it to me. She reached out, holding the diary, her fingers trembling. Calder loosened his grip on Jonah just slightly, eager for the book. Jonah gasped for air. Margaret stepped closer. 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 Calder smiled. Good woman, Margaret whispered. Burn in hell. And she slammed the oil lamp into his head. It burst in a flash of fire and glass. Calder roared, stumbling back as flames licked at his coat. You witch! Jonah rolled away, coughing. The fire spread fast, across the floor, up the table legs, onto Calder's coat. Calder dropped the burning fabric, stomping the flames, but they grew faster than he could kill them. Margaret grabbed Jonah's arm. We must go now. The flames reached the curtains. The cabin filled with smoke. Jonah rose unsteadily. Calder lunged for the door, but collapsed as a burning beam fell in front of him. He clawed through the smoke. You can't run, he choked. The diary. I will get that diary. I swear it. But the fire swallowed his voice. Margaret dragged Jonah toward the back window. Come on, come on, they pushed it open. Cold night air rushed in. Snow fell harder now, thick, fast, merciless. Jonah climbed out first, then reached for her. Give me your hand. Margaret climbed through. The diary clutched to her chest, her shawl, catching embers, her breath short and ragged. Behind them, the cabin burned like a torch in the dark. Jonah pulled her into the snow. Margaret collapsed beside him, coughing. The flames roared behind them. Jonah grabbed her shoulders. Margaret, we must move. If Calder gets out. She looked up. The flames illuminated the forest like dawn. But through the fire, a dark silhouette moved. A figure, burned but alive, stumbling through the flames. Calder. Jonah's eyes widened in terror. He's coming. Calder stepped into the snow, smoking coat hissing. He pointed a charred finger at Margaret. The diary, he rasped. And then, from deep in the woods, a shot rang out. Calder jerked sideways and fell, face first into the snow. Margaret gasped. Jonah spun around, searching the trees. Footsteps crunched. A second figure emerged from the woods. Tall, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, hat dusted with snow. The stranger raised the rifle again, then lowered it as he approached. Margaret's heart stopped. Jonah whispered, Oh, God! The man stepped closer, and Mary Margaret's breath left her chest entirely. Because the man who walked out of the snow, the one who had just saved her life, the one who should have been dead, was Edward Hale. Snow drifted through the trees like drifting ashes from heaven and hell combined. Margaret's breath steamed in the frozen air as she stared, unable to blink, unable to breathe, unable to understand what her eyes insisted was true. Edward Hale, her husband, the man she had buried, stood before her, alive. His wool coat hung heavy on his shoulders, worn thin at the elbows. His boots were caked in frost. Snow clung to his beard, which had grown longer, grayer, harsher than she remembered. His breath rose in white clouds, slow and tired. And his eyes, oh Lord, his eyes, those gentle, deep-set eyes that had watched her through decades of marriage, now held a pain she had never seen. Edward lowered the smoking rifle. Margaret, he whispered. Her knees weakened. She swayed, and Jonah caught her shoulder just in time. Jonah's voice broke into the silence, raw with disbelief. Edward, how? You were supposed to be dead. We buried you. Edward lowered his gaze. I am dead to Willow Creek, he murmured. That was the point. Margaret's throat tightened. The point? She whispered. Edward Hale, what have you done? Edward stepped closer, boots sinking into the deep snow. Jonah moved instinctively in front of Margaret. Edward stopped. Jonah, he said softly, please, let me speak to her. Jonah hesitated. Pain flickered across his face. But slowly, reluctantly, he stepped aside. Margaret took one trembling step forward. She stared at the man who had shared her life, her home, her failures, her hopes. The man she had washed and laid to rest with shaking hands. The man she had mourned. She whispered, You are alive? Edward bowed his head. Yes. He swallowed hard. And I am sorry. Margaret gasped, her voice cracking. Saw thee? Edward, sorry does not begin to touch the cruelty of what you've done. Her voice rose, echoing across the trees. You let me bury an empty coffin. You let me grieve. You let me sit beside a grave, believing my husband was cold beneath the earth. Her tears froze on her cheeks. How could you? Edward's shoulders slumped. Because Calder was coming, he said. And if he thought I was alive, he'd come for you too. Margaret shook her head violently. You should have told me. You should have trusted me. Edward stepped closer. And if I did, Margaret, you wouldn't be alive tonight. They stared at each other, two aging hearts, held together by 30 years of love and years of silence. The fire from the burning cabin flickered behind them, sending orange light dancing across Edward's weathered face. Margaret trembled. You left me alone, she whispered. You left me with questions, with regrets, with an empty chair and no goodbye. Edward's breath hitched. I wrote everything in the diary, he said. I meant to burn it, but I couldn't. I wanted you to know the truth if the worst happened. But I prayed you would never find it. Margaret clutched the diary to her chest. Then why show yourself now? She whispered. Why break your death? Edward lifted the rifle, glancing at Calder's body in the snow. Because Calder was coming to finish what he started, he said. And because he was coming for you. Jonah stepped beside Margaret. He almost got her, Jonah murmured, wiping blood from his lip. Damn near burned the whole cabin down. Edward's face tightened with grief and fury. I should have stopped him sooner. Margaret stared at her husband. Then tell me, Edward, she said softly, what happened after you died? Edward inhaled deeply. His breath trembled out like smoke. Calder found me, Edward began. The night before the stranger found my body by the elm grove. Margaret blinked. You were alive then? Edward nodded slowly. Yes, but not unharmed. Calder's men came to finish their job. Jonah tried to warn me through a message, but it reached too late. He looked down at his hands. I fought back. I survived the attack, but not by much. Margaret's voice trembled. The doctor said you had no marks, no wounds. Edward's jaw tightened. Because Calder made sure there wouldn't be any visible. Margaret covered her mouth. He stunned me, Edward whispered. And when I woke, Jonah was dragging me away from the grove. Calder's men had already planned to stage my death. Jonah was trying to undo it. Jonah stepped forward. I pulled him into the woods, Jonah said. Hid him in the hunting shack and got the doctor to claim he'd died. I thought I bought us time. Enough time for him to escape. Margaret's breath caught. And all of Willow Creek believed it, Edward said quietly. Including you. Margaret pressed a hand to her heart. You let me bury you, she whispered. Edward closed his eyes. It broke me, Maggie, more than death ever could. She shook her head. You left me. Yes, he whispered. To save you. Margaret turned away, covering her face. Edward watched her with eyes filled with 30 years of regret. Every day afterwards, he said softly, I watched from afar. I stayed near Willow Creek. I never went far. I kept to the woods. If anyone had known I was alive, Calder would have come back for you. Margaret trembled. So you live like a ghost while I grieve your grave. Yes, Edward whispered. Jonah lowered his head. He lived worse than a ghost. Half-starved, hiding in hunting cabins, changing camps every winter. Edward nodded. I waited for the day they'd stop searching for me. But Calder didn't stop. He watched you, watched the cabin, watched anyone who asked questions. Margaret's knees weakened. The night you wrote the diary, you knew you were dying. Edward didn't speak. He didn't have to. Margaret felt the truth in the stillness. You knew Calder had found you. Edward finally said, Yes, I knew death was coming. I wanted you to know everything if Jonah failed, or if I didn't get to you in time. Margaret held the diary tighter. And now Calder is dead, she whispered. Edward looked at the fallen body in the snow. I thought killing him would bring peace, he murmured. But looking at you now, I see I'm too late. Margaret turned away again, tears filling her eyes. The snowstorm quieted, as though giving space for grief. Then, a faint sound broke the silence. A snapping twig. Edward stiffened. Jonah reached for his knife. Margaret tensed. Edward raised his rifle again. We're not alone, he whispered. From the dark trees, a figure emerged, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak, face half hidden, moving slowly through the snow. Margaret's breath caught. Jonah whispered, Oh no, no, no. Edward stepped forward. Who's there? He demanded. The figure stopped, lifted a trembling hand. and in a soft, shaking voice, a woman whispered, "Edward, is that truly you?" Edward gasped. Margaret froze. The woman stepped closer, snow falling around her like drifting feathers. Her hood slipped back, revealing a face Margaret knew from the diary. A face she had never expected to see. A face Edward once loved before he loved her. The woman whispered through tears, "I've come for the diary, because part of its truth belongs to me." Margaret's world shattered. Edward whispered her name in horror, "Hannah." Margaret felt the diary slip in her fingers and fall into the snow. The diary lay half buried in the snow, its leather cover darkening with melting flakes. Margaret stared at it in shock, her breath shallow, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Hannah. Edward had whispered her name with the kind of broken tenderness Margaret had not heard in years, and it pierced her like a blade. The woman stepped closer through the drifting snow. Her cloak was worn, edges frayed, face pale and tired from travel. She looked older than the memory in Edward's diary, but still carried the fragile beauty of a life once soft, once hopeful. Edward could barely speak. "Hannah, I thought Calder." Hannah lifted a trembling hand. "He tried," she said softly. "But I survived. I hid. I've been hiding for 30 years. Jonah swore under his breath, stepping backward. Margaret felt her throat tighten until it hurt to breathe. Hannah's gaze shifted to her. "You must be Margaret," she said gently. "I recognized you from Edward's drawings." Margaret felt the blow of those words like a punch to the stomach. "Drawings?" she whispered. Edward closed his eyes in anguish. Hannah reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, wrapped bundle. She opened it slowly. Inside were several folded pieces of paper, yellowed with time, edges cracked from age. "Our lives were tangled," Hannah said softly. "More than you ever knew." She held one of the papers out. Margaret's hand trembled as she took it. The paper unfolded with a faint crackling, and there, drawn with charcoal, trembling strokes, was a portrait of herself, Margaret, younger, smiling faintly, her hair pulled back just the way she wore it the day she married Edward. Margaret gasped, breath breaking. I don't understand." Edward took a shaky step toward her. "I drew you," he whispered, "in the years after I left Hannah. When I met you, when I fell for you, when you became my whole world." Margaret's heartbeat faltered. "But why give the drawings to her?" Edward closed his eyes. "Because Hannah needed to know I had moved on, that I cared for you, that I chose you." Margaret's hands trembled as she held the portrait. She fought back tears, yet they came anyway. "This is too much," she whispered. "Too many secrets, too many ghosts." Hannah nodded slowly. "I came for the diary," she said, "not to take him away from you." Margaret lifted her eyes sharply. Hannah's voice softened. "I came because my story is written in its pages, and I need to know how he described the winter he and I survived." Edward swallowed hard. "I wrote the truth," he said quietly. Margaret's voice cracked. "Then tell me the truth now. All of it. I deserve that much." Edward's shoulders sagged under the weight of 3 decades of silence. He breathed deeply, snow fogging around him, and began. "In 1853, Edward said slowly, Hannah and I were engaged." Margaret closed her eyes, pain slicing through her. Edward continued. "We were young, poor, foolish in many ways, but we dreamed of a life together. Until the men hired to stop the railway came for me. And for Hannah." Hannah lowered her head. "They wanted to punish him. They used me to do it." Edward's voice trembled. "I thought she had died that winter. I believed it for 30 years. That guilt, it broke me." Hannah stepped closer. "I survived," she whispered. "Barely. I ran, changed my name, hid in a boarding house in the next territory." She lifted her eyes to Margaret. "I kept the drawings he made of you, because I needed to let go, needed to accept he had a new life that I could not join." Margaret swallowed fearfully. "So you left him?" Hannah nodded. "Yes, for his sake, and for yours." Edward inhaled shakily. "She saved my life again by disappearing. If Calder had known she lived, he would have killed her." Jonah cleared his throat softly, and he almost did. Hannah's eyes glistened. I've lived my entire life in fear of the men who hunted him. Tonight, I followed Calder here. I wanted to see if the danger was finally over. Margaret listened quietly, painfully. Her heart hurt in ways she had no words for. But she was not done. She stepped forward. "Edward," she whispered, "why didn't you tell me about her?" Edward's eyes softened with a grief that had been buried too deep for too long. "Because I loved you, and I feared that if you knew the whole truth, you would think you were my second choice." Margaret's breath broke. "Was I?" Edward stepped closer, tears in his eyes. "You were the home my soul didn't know how to ask for. The peace I never believed I deserved. You were not second, Margaret. You were salvation." She closed her eyes as tears fell. Jonah looked away, giving them privacy. Hannah lowered her gaze respectfully. Edward reached for his wife's hands. "I hid the diary not because I wanted secrets, but because I wanted to spare you the burden of the past. I thought I'd die quietly before the truth hurt you." Margaret whispered, "But the truth found me anyway." Edward nodded. "Yes, and I am sorry." She squeezed his hand weakly. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered. He bowed his head. "I will wait for forgiveness. A day, a year, a lifetime, as long as you need." Snow fell gently around them. Breath softened. Tension loosened. The storm quieted. Margaret finally knelt in the snow beside the diary. Her fingers brushed its cover. "I will read it all," she whispered. "Every page, every truth." Edward nodded. "You deserve nothing less." Hannah stepped back. "Then I will go," she said softly. "My part of the story is over." "No," Margaret said suddenly. Hannah paused. Margaret lifted her chin. "Your part is in the diary, too. You deserve to know what he wrote. You deserve closure as well." Hannah's eyes filled. Edward closed his. Jonah shifted his weight, humbled. Margaret stood and held the diary between them all. "This story belongs to all of us," she said. "Pain shared becomes lighter." Hannah stepped closer. Jonah joined them. Edward reached for Margaret's hand. The four stood together around the diary as the forest quieted around them, soft with snow. Margaret opened the diary to the final page. Edward whispered, "The last page was meant for you." Margaret read aloud through tears. "If Margaret ever finds this diary, let it be known my last breath belonged to her. My last regret was hiding the truth. My last wish is that she knows she was loved more deeply than any man has words for." Margaret's sob filled the forest. Edward wrapped his arms around her, holding her as though holding her could undo 30 years of silence. Jonah wiped a tear from his cheek. Hannah closed her eyes. The storm stopped fully, leaving the world still. Margaret finally looked up at Edward. "What happens now?" Edward's answer was soft. "We live, if you'll have me." Margaret took a long, trembling breath. Then she placed her forehead to his and whispered, "I lost you once. I won't lose you again." He held her tighter. Jonah stepped back, relief softening his features. Hannah smiled sadly but warmly. Margaret reached for Hannah's hand. "You are part of this story, too. You deserve peace." Hannah nodded. "Then let this be the end of it," she whispered. Margaret looked at Edward. "At long last," she said softly, "the truth can rest." He nodded. "And so can I." The four turned away from the burnt ruins of the cabin and began walking toward the dim lanterns of Willow Creek glimmering through the trees. Together, a broken past mended by truth, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of love that endures. The diary stayed in Margaret's hands, no longer a burden, but a bridge between the life she thought she lived and the life she would build again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales from the Old West, where every tale brings warmth, wisdom, and the beauty of a life well lived.